A shy businessman became a billionaire through his close friendship with Guyana's president. And now people are asking if their relationship gave him unfair access to the country's massive new oil wealth. Bobby Ramroop is one of the most powerful and controversial businessmen in Guyana today. A man whose massive wealth and extremely close relationship with former President Bharrat Jagdeo have raised serious questions about corruption, favoritism, and how a small group of connected insiders have benefited from Guyana's dramatic oil boom. Born Robert Bobby Ramroop in the 1960s in Guyana, Bobby came from a business family that was already successful in various commercial ventures. Unlike many Guyanese who grew up in poverty, Bobby's family had money and connections that gave him advantages from childhood. His family owned businesses and property, and young Bobby grew up understanding how business and money worked from watching his family's operations. Bobby was always described as quiet and shy, someone who avoided publicity and preferred working behind the scenes rather than seeking attention. This personality trait would continue throughout his life, as Bobby built enormous wealth and influence while staying largely out of public view. He was educated in Guyana and showed intelligence and business sense from a young age. After completing his education, he joined his family's business interests and began expanding them into new areas. The Ramroop family business portfolio eventually included retail stores, real estate, construction, manufacturing, and various other ventures across Guyana, the most important relationship in Bobby Ramroop's life, at least in terms of his business success, was his friendship with Bharrat Jagdeo. The two men met when they were young and became extremely close friends. Jagdeo would eventually become president of Guyana, serving from 1999 to 2011, and then later serving as vice president starting in 2020 when his party returned to power. Throughout these years in government, Jagdeo's friendship with Bobby remained strong and became the subject of intense scrutiny and controversy. Critics accused Jagdeo of using his presidential power to help his best friend become wealthy through favorable government contracts, special treatment, and inside access to opportunities. The nature of their friendship was unusually close even by the standards of lifelong friends. They were frequently seen together socially, traveled together, and were described by people who knew them as being like brothers. This closeness would not necessarily be a problem except that Bobby was a major businessman, seeking government contracts and dealing with government agencies while his best friend was the president, controlling those contracts and agencies. This created obvious conflicts of interest where it was impossible to know if Bobby's business success came from his skills and legitimate opportunities, or from his presidential friendship giving him unfair advantages over competitors. During Jagdeo's presidency from 1999 to 2011, Bobby's business empire expanded dramatically. His companies won major government contracts worth millions of dollars. He received import licenses and tax breaks that competitors struggled to obtain. He got approvals for projects that others found impossible to get approved. Government agencies that were slow and bureaucratic for everyone else seemed to work efficiently when dealing with Bobby's interests. All of this could have been coincidence, but to many observers it looked like clear evidence that the president was helping his best friend get rich using government power. One of the most controversial aspects of Bobby's business dealings involved a printing company he owned that received massive government contracts to print things like passports, driver's licenses, and other official documents. These contracts were worth many millions of dollars and were awarded without competitive bidding processes that would have allowed other companies to compete for the work. Critics accused Jagdeo of simply handing these lucrative contracts to his friend without following proper procedures. The government defended the arrangements by saying Bobby's company had special capabilities and security clearances needed for printing sensitive documents. But skeptics believe this was just an excuse to justify favoritism. Bobby also benefited enormously from Guyana's emerging oil industry, which has transformed the country's economy since major oil discoveries were announced starting in 2015. Guyana, which had always been one of the poorest countries in South America, suddenly found itself sitting on billions of barrels of valuable oil. International oil companies including ExxonMobil rushed to develop these resources, and the contracts and business opportunities created by the oil boom made some Guyanese very wealthy. Bobby positioned himself perfectly to benefit from this transformation, with his companies providing various services to the oil industry and related sectors. The exact size of Bobby's fortune is unknown because he is a private businessman who does not have to publicly disclose his wealth. but estimates suggest he is worth hundreds of millions of dollars and possibly over $1 billion. This makes him one of the wealthiest people in Guyana, a country where most citizens live on just a few dollars per day. The contrast between Bobby's enormous wealth and the poverty most Guyanese experience is stark and troubling to many people who believe the country's resources should benefit all citizens, not just a few well-connected insiders. Bobby's business empire touches many parts of the Guyanese economy. His interests include retail chains selling everything from household goods to building materials, real estate developments, construction companies, manufacturing facilities, and service businesses. Walking around Georgetown, Guyana's capital, you will see many businesses that Bobby owns or has major stakes in. He employs thousands of Guyanese workers across his various companies, which his supporters point to as evidence that his business success benefits the broader economy by creating jobs. Critics respond that the jobs would exist regardless of who owned the businesses. And the real question is whether Bobby got unfair advantages in building his empire. Bobby's personal life is kept very private, which is consistent with his shy personality and preference for staying out of the spotlight. He is married and has children, but very little information is publicly available about his family because they avoid media attention. Unlike some wealthy businessmen who enjoy showing off their success through social media posts and public appearances, Bobby lives quietly and tries to keep his private life separate from his business dealings. His home is reportedly luxurious with all the comforts that enormous wealth can buy, but he does not flaunt his lifestyle in obvious public ways. This privacy has actually worked against Bobby in some ways because it feeds suspicions and conspiracy theories. When a businessman with obvious government connections becomes enormously wealthy but refuses to talk publicly about how he made his money, people naturally wonder what he is hiding. Bobby rarely gives interviews to journalists and has never publicly addressed the corruption allegations and questions about his relationship with Jagdeo. This silence makes him seem secretive and fuels beliefs that his business dealings would not stand up to public scrutiny. The return of Jagdeo's political party to power in 2020 raised new concerns about Bobby's continued influence. Although Jagdeo himself became vice president rather than president again, he is widely seen as the real power behind the new government. With his friend back in a top government position, Bobby's already strong business position seemed likely to become even stronger. Critics warned that the oil boom wealth flowing into Guyana would be captured by the same connected insiders who had benefited during Jagdeo's previous presidency, with Bobby being exhibit number one of this problem. Opposition politicians in Guyana have repeatedly called for investigations into Bobby's business dealings and his relationship with Jagdeo. They have demanded transparency about how contracts were awarded and whether proper procedures were followed. They have asked for audits of government agencies that gave Bobby's companies special treatment. However, these calls for investigation have gone nowhere when Jagdeo's party controls the government, and even when opposition parties have been in power. Investigations have been blocked or gone nowhere, suggesting that powerful forces protect Bobby from serious scrutiny. International observers and anti-corruption organizations have also raised concerns about Guyana's governance and the appearance of favoritism benefiting connected businessmen like Bobby. When a country suddenly comes into massive oil wealth, there is always danger that the money will be stolen or misused by corrupt officials and their associates. Guyana's weak institutions, history of political corruption, and obvious examples like Bobby's unexplained wealth all raise red flags that the oil money may not be managed properly for the benefit of all Guyanese. Bobby's defenders argue that he is simply a talented businessman who built success through hard work, smart decisions, and taking risks that paid off. They point out that his family was already in business before his friendship with Jagdeo became politically relevant, so he had a foundation to build on. They note that his companies employ many people and contribute to the economy through taxes and economic activity. They argue that there is no actual proof of corruption or illegality, just suspicions and political attacks from opponents trying to damage Jagdeo by targeting his friend. These defenses have some merit. No court has ever convicted Bobby of corruption or found evidence of specific illegal acts. Being friends with the president is not illegal, and doing business in a country where your friend happens to be president is not automatically corruption. Success in business often does involve having good connections and relationships, and Bobby's friendship with Jagdeo could be seen as simply a valuable business connection rather than evidence of corruption. However, The scale of Bobby's success and the timing of his biggest business growth corresponding exactly with his best friend's time and power creates reasonable suspicions that cannot be dismissed. When a businessman becomes enormously wealthy during the exact period when his best friend controls the government, and when that businessman's companies receive major government contracts and favorable treatment, it is reasonable for citizens to demand transparency and accountability. The burden should be on Bobby and Jagdeo to demonstrate that everything was done properly, rather than on critics to prove wrongdoing. The impact of cases like Bobby Ramroop on Guyana's political culture and public trust is deeply damaging. When ordinary citizens see a small group of connected insiders becoming fabulously wealthy while they struggle with poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunities, it breeds cynicism and anger. People lose faith in democracy and government when they believe the system is rigged to benefit the rich and connected. Young people become disillusioned and either try to leave the country for opportunities elsewhere, or they conclude that the only way to succeed is through connections and corruption rather than hard work and merit. The oil boom should be a transformational opportunity for Guyana to develop infrastructure, improve education and healthcare, diversify the economy, and raise living standards for all citizens. Norway is often cited as an example of a country that managed oil wealth responsibly, using it to build a massive sovereign wealth fund that benefits all citizens. But Norway had strong institutions, transparent governance, and a culture of accountability that Guyana lacks. Without major reforms to increase transparency and reduce corruption, there is serious risk that Guyana's oil wealth will mostly benefit a small elite connected to whoever holds political power, with people like Bobby Ramroop being prime examples of this problem. Bobby's relationship with the oil industry specifically deserves scrutiny. His companies provide various services to oil companies operating in Guyana, earning substantial revenues from this business. The question is whether he got these contracts because his companies offered the best services at competitive prices, or because his connection to Jagdeo made oil companies believe that working with Bobby would smooth their relationships with the government. International oil companies operating in developing countries often work with local partners who are politically connected, seeing this as necessary to navigate complex political environments. This practice can border on corruption when the local partners are essentially being paid for their political connections rather than any real business value they provide. As of 2025, Bobby continues to expand his business empire and remains one of Guyana's most powerful businessmen. The oil boom continues bringing new wealth and opportunities to Guyana, and Bobby seems positioned to capture a large share of these opportunities. His friendship with Jagdeo remains strong, and with Jagdeo holding major government power, Bobby's business prospects look excellent. Whether this represents entrepreneurial success or corruption depends largely on your political perspective and what you believe about the relationship between business and government in Guyana. Looking at Bobby Ramroop's story overall, we see the classic problem of how business and politics intersect in developing countries. Personal relationships matter enormously in small societies where everyone knows everyone. Political connections can open doors and create opportunities that would not exist otherwise. The line between legitimate networking and corrupt favoritism is often blurry and hard to define. Bobby's case sits right on this blurry line, with enough legitimate business activity to provide plausible explanations, but also enough suspicious circumstances to create reasonable doubts about whether everything was done fairly. What is clear is that Bobby's enormous wealth, built during a period when his best friend controlled Guyana's government, represents a failure of governance and accountability. Whether or not specific corrupt acts occurred, the system that allowed such obvious conflicts of interest to persist without transparency or accountability is fundamentally broken. Fixing this system requires much stronger institutions, greater transparency about government contracts and business dealings, independent oversight bodies with real power, and a political culture that values fairness over personal loyalty. Subscribe now to uncover more explosive stories of billionaire businessmen whose political connections and controversial dealings transformed their countries and made them unimaginably wealthy.